Hi guys. Before we proceed to this video, we've got something very important to share with you. Neoliberalism, Inequality and Authoritarianism by Professor John V. Kofis is available for purchase. You can order it directly from the publisher Little French eBooks or through Amazon.
On September 11, 1990, President George Herbert Walker Bush declared a new world order. This was during the Persian Gulf crisis because of Iraq's incursion into Kuwait. At that time, President Bush the elder stated that the new world order would be based on certain principles, which included international cooperation. It included peace, ironically, amid a crisis. It included justice, whatever that vague term implies. And it included a very important principle of the United Nations, which the United States, by the way, essentially was the main driver in creating during the Franklin Roosevelt administration. A year later, in 1991, President Bush added that the New World Order would be based on the rule of law. 35 years later, the United States has deviated sharply from those principles that President Bush declared in the unipolar world order when the communist bloc collapsed and the former Soviet republics quickly became integrated, including the Russian Federation, into the world capitalist economy. What we have in the mid-2020s is a highly fragmented world. Although there are scholars and analysts who believe, geopolitical, geoeconomic strategists who believe, and the United Nations, as well as the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, have also conducted studies with regard to this issue of a fragmented world, both in terms of economic fragmentation with economic blocs like the European Union and the US essentially using the geoeconomic tool as a weapon, in other words, tariffs and sanctions. That's a reality. But also, even more important, the US-led global West, okay, which includes, by the way, Japan and South Korea, the two most important countries in Asia, in East Asia, rely increasingly in the mid-2020s, given the sharp escalation of defense budgets in all across NATO, for example, jumping from 3% of GDP to 5% of GDP, sharp rise in defense in Japan as well as South Korea. All of this indicates that militarism, not international cooperation implying diplomacy, militarism, military solutions have become the new norm in the global West, which compels, this doesn't mean, by the way, that the China-led global South, which includes Russia in this mix, in other words, led the BRICS group that China is leading, which includes India and Russia as the two other major powers. That doesn't mean that they are not following suit. However, it is very clear that there are two visions in the world within these two blocks, although I repeat, there are scholarly works and serious analysts who argue that besides these two blocks, the US-led global West versus the China-led global South bloc, there are also middle powers, and by middle powers, scholars include India, Brazil, they throw in Turkey, for example. Okay. Um, that's fine. The question is, of course, whether those countries are behind the US or behind China or playing both sides. India, for example, is a good one on this one. So is Turkey, for that matter. Brazil, a little bit less so, especially after Trump's adventures in Venezuela, overthrowing the government of Nicolas Maduro on January 3rd. The various issues that I discuss, and this is a very complex topic, by the way, in the longer analytical video, is whether the world is headed towards some sort of clash and why this is happening, and whether one vision, one block is more preferable than the other, more beneficial to civilization and to the world. Let me begin by stating, by the way, unequivocally, that there is no utopia. That's only in Plato's Republic and in Thomas More's book by the same title, namely Utopia. Utopia doesn't exist. There is no ideal solution. The question is, there is no ideal society. The question is, what is a bit lesser evil and a bit more beneficial for the, and I hate to sound 19th century utilitarian on this issue, but what is more beneficial for more people? What is the greatest good for the greatest number? And this is where there are, of course, divergent opinions, because there are signs that within both blocs there are authoritarian regimes, and even the so-called democratic regimes, simply because they have elections, are in essence hybrid authoritarian regimes led by the United States, which, of course, it is no secret that under President Trump, although President Trump is very blatant about it, the reality is that the policies of Democrats were in fact not geared toward peace or social justice, whether it's Obama or Biden, by the way. When you look at the policy, strictly at the policy, divorce the rhetoric, and just focus on foreign policy and domestic policy, the question is, to what degree was the policy committed towards social justice? Now, we have, of course, a president in Trump in both terms, but especially in the second term, who makes no secret of ambitions for amassing power on a world scale, going so far as to perhaps jokingly calling himself king of the world. This is not to say that there is no authoritarianism in the China-led global South. This is not to say that the global South is free of problems of social justice and peace. Obviously, Russia is part of the BRICS group, and Russia did attack Ukraine. There are complex reasons regarding its national security zone, regarding the promises NATO had made about expanding east through the Black Sea, the Transcaucasus region, and Central Asia. But that's a different issue. The reality is Russia has, from the period of the Romanov dynasty to the Soviet era to the Putin era has had a record of militarism. So this is not and very weak commitment to social justice historically, again from the Romanov to the Soviet to the, although the Soviets under Lenin tried to address this, Lenin lived a very short period, and then the Stalinist era uh, essentially wiped a lot of that out. Um, so what we have is this clash of two blocks, and the world obviously trying to decide which is the lesser evil and where can they get the greatest benefits, and within each country, how do those greater benefits filter down to the population, to the general population, to the working class, and to the middle class, depending the size of the middle class on each country. Uh, this is hardly a contest of good versus evil. This is a contest of evil versus lesser evil, and that is at best, by the way. It is alarming that this is happening, and however, it is happening for structural reasons. The systemic reasons for the formation of these blocks has to do with the evolution of the capitalist world economy. At the core of the capitalist world economy was the United States much of the 20th century, especially after World War I, when Europe was debilitated economically and politically and militarily, and the rise of the United States at the core of the capitalist world system. The United States, however, reached its peak, ironically, in the Truman Eisenhower era and then began to decline. And the fact is that China, measured in purchasing power parity, um, gross domestic product, GDP, is the world's largest economy. And put together with the BRICS group, the China led global south, even in nominal value, is much stronger economically. It's far higher in GDP, nominal as well as purchasing power parity value, than the US led global west. But that's not as important. What is important is, what are the prospects for the US led global west? Again, I include Japan and South Korea in this group and a few other minor countries in Asia. But what are the prospects for the 21st century? The US is desperately trying to recapture the dream of Pax Americana of mid 20th century, which is gone. And the way it's trying to recapture it is through the use of the military. In January 2026, the bombing of Caracas, Venezuela, the snatching of President Maduro, the declaration of Trump as perhaps again, like I said, maybe he was joking, as the president of Venezuela. In other words, the reducing Venezuela, and a member of the Organization of American States, by the way, which by its charter, this is not supposed to happen, reducing it to a satellite of the United States, and declaring that its number one asset, oil, is under the control of the United States and the US, and any country that wants to purchase oil from Venezuela has to go through the US. That is 19th century imperialism. That is not what George Herbert Walker Bush declared in September 1990 and then added rule of law in 91. Coup d'etat is not what he had in mind. Neocolonialism is not what he had in mind. when he talked about cooperation, peace, and justice. And yet, here is where we are. And Europe and Japan and South Korea are militarizing because they too, here's the irony of all this, are afraid of their own ally, the United States. They're afraid of the United States because the United States has proved that it can turn against them using the economy as a weapon, namely tariffs. So the world is indeed fractured, fragmented, and this makes it very dangerous, extremely dangerous, because a number of the countries on the opposite blocks, the China led global south versus the US led global west, have nuclear weapons. And they also have the means to destabilize the entire world, both economically and geopolitically. I invite you to join me for the longer analytical video on this very complex topic. This is indeed a topic that requires volumes, not just a single book, because it is very complex and it has so many tentacles. Um, that it does require quite a bit. But I will reduce it to some of the essential elements and try to see if we can make sense of it. I thank you very much. I ask you to write comments. Um, and by all means, join this channel. Thank you very much.